The wedding was perfect, until a little boy ran down the aisle shouting, "Daddy, why are you marrying her?" The entire crowd gasped. The billionaire groom froze, his bride's face turned pale, and the child's mother stepped forward, her eyes burning with betrayal. Who was she? And why did she look at the groom like he had just destroyed her world? What happened next left everyone speechless. A wedding day is supposed to be the happiest moment in a couple's life. But for billionaire Ethan Carlisle, his perfect day turned into a nightmare. The second a small voice echoed through the grand cathedral, "Daddy, why are you marrying her?" The guests gasped. The bride, Amelia Kensington, a woman of grace and status, clutched Ethan's hand, her face turning ghostly pale. And at the entrance, standing with unwavering determination, was a woman Ethan never thought he'd see again, Lena Harper. But she wasn't alone. Beside her stood a little boy, no older than 5, his eyes mirroring Ethan's. For a split second, the world seemed to stop. The chandelier's golden light cast long shadows as whispers spread like wildfire. Amelia's grip tightened, but Ethan didn't move. His heart pounded, his breath hitched, because he knew, deep down without a single doubt, that the child was his. 5 years ago, Ethan Carlisle was a man who had everything: power, wealth, and a reputation as an untouchable force in the business world. Cold, calculating, and ruthless, he built an empire with his own hands. Love, it was nothing more than a fleeting illusion, a weakness he couldn't afford. Then came Lena, a sharp-witted journalist, fearless and unshaken by his intimidating presence. She wasn't impressed by his money or status. Instead, she challenged him, saw through his icy exterior, and touched a part of him he never knew existed. Their love was intense, reckless, and all-consuming. But love wasn't enough. Ethan's past wounds made him push her away, choosing his ambition over their love. He hurt her in ways she never expected. And when she left, heartbroken, shattered, he convinced himself it was for the best. He drowned himself in work, convincing the world he was fine. But he wasn't. Lena had moved on, or so he thought, until now. Standing in front of him, she wasn't the same woman he once knew. Her eyes, once filled with warmth, now burned with betrayal. Her lips trembled, not from love, but from unspoken pain. And the little boy by her side? The proof of a past he had unknowingly abandoned. Amelia, still gripping Ethan's arm, cleared her throat, forcing a smile as she whispered, "Ethan, who is this woman?" But Ethan didn't answer. His gaze remained locked on Lena, a silent battle of emotions warring between them. Lena's voice finally broke the silence, low, controlled, and sharp as a blade. "You really don't recognize him, do you?" She took a step forward, shielding the boy as if protecting him from the man who should have been his father. 5 years, Ethan. 5 years, and you never once looked back." Her words cut deeper than any wound. Ethan felt his world shift beneath him. 5 years. A child. His child. And he had no idea. As the weight of reality crashed down on him, he realized one thing. This wedding was never going to happen. Because the past he thought was buried had just returned, demanding answers. And this time, he couldn't run from it. 5 years ago, the first time Ethan Carlisle saw Lena Harper, she wasn't wearing a designer dress or standing in the grand halls of the elite. She was sitting on the marble steps of a city courthouse, a notepad in one hand and a cold coffee in the other, her brows furrowed in frustration as she tapped her pen against her lips. She was waiting for a story. Ethan had walked past without a second glance until she called out his name. "Mr. Carlisle, is it true you forced the Harrison merger by threatening legal action?" He stopped mid-step. No one dared to speak to him like that. Turning, he found a woman with striking eyes locked onto his, unwavering. Most people cowered under his gaze. She didn't even blink. "Excuse me?" His voice was cold, clipped, meant to end the conversation before it started. But Lena just stood up, tucking the notepad into her jacket. "You heard me." A smirk tugged at the corner of his lips. No one had ever challenged him so boldly before. "And what if I did? Then you're exactly the ruthless businessman they say you are." Her tone was matter of fact, but there was something else in her eyes. Curiosity. He should have walked away. He should have ignored the journalist digging for a headline. But instead, he took a step closer, intrigued. "And if I'm not?" She tilted her head, lips curving into a slow, knowing smile. "Then prove it." That was the beginning. Their encounters started with heated debates, stolen glances, and late-night conversations that stretched until dawn. Ethan, the man who built walls around his heart, found himself lowering his defenses. Lena wasn't like the women who chased his wealth. She wanted his mind, his thoughts, his soul. And without realizing it, he gave them to her. Their love story wasn't a whirlwind. It was a slow burn, built on stolen moments and quiet confessions. He found himself drawn to her laughter, the way she scribbled notes on napkins during their dinners, the way she could disarm his cold demeanor with a single touch. But not all love stories end the way they should. The breaking point came one rainy evening. Ethan had just closed the biggest deal of his career, securing Carlisle Industries as the top financial empire in the country. But when he walked into Lena's apartment, drenched from the storm, he found her standing in the dim light, holding a letter in her trembling hands. The letter he had written but never meant for her to find. "You deserve better than me." Her fingers clenched around the paper. "When were you going to tell me?" Ethan's jaw tightened. He had written it on a night of weakness, convinced that Lena deserved a man who could love her freely, not one who carried the scars of his past. But now, as he saw the pain in her eyes, he realized he had made the biggest mistake of his life. "I didn't mean for you to see that," he said, voice low. "But you meant it," she whispered. "You've been pulling away for weeks. Was this your way of ending things without having to face me?" He wanted to tell her she was wrong, that he loved her more than anything, but the words caught in his throat. He had spent his whole life keeping people at a distance, and now, when it mattered most, he couldn't bring himself to fight. Lena swallowed, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "You once told me you weren't afraid of anything. But that's not true, is it?" She stepped closer, searching his face. "You're terrified of love." Silence hung between them, heavier than the storm outside. Then, with a slow nod, Lena folded the letter and placed it on the table. "I won't beg you to stay." Her voice was steady, but he could hear the heartbreak beneath it. "If you don't want this, just say it." Ethan's hands curled into fists. Every part of him wanted to reach for her, to tell her that she was the only thing that ever truly mattered. But fear, his oldest companion, held him back. And so, he did the only thing he knew how to do. He let her go. Present day. Now, standing in the middle of his wedding, staring at the woman he abandoned and the child he never knew existed, Ethan felt something he hadn't felt in years. Regret. Because Lena had been right. He was terrified of love, and in running from it, he had lost the only thing that ever truly mattered. Ethan had faced boardrooms filled with ruthless investors, survived betrayals from people he trusted, and built an empire from the ground up. But standing here, staring at the woman he once loved and the child he never knew existed, he felt powerless for the first time in his life. The weight of the past crashed into him like a tidal wave. Lena's eyes were locked onto his, her body tense, her hand resting protectively on the boy's shoulder. There was no warmth, no hesitation, only cold resolve. She had come here with purpose, not to beg, not to plead, but to make him face what he had left behind. Amelia cleared her throat, her grip tightening around Ethan's arm. "Ethan, I asked you a question," she said, forcing a smile for the crowd, though her voice shook. "Who is she?" Ethan opened his mouth, but no words came. His thoughts were chaos. His son. 5 years. Lena. She had raised him alone. She had suffered alone. The boy, his son, was staring at him with an expression too familiar. Ethan saw himself in those eyes, in the set of his jaw, in the way his little hands clenched at his sides. And then it hit him. Lena hadn't come to beg for anything. She had come to give him a choice, to either claim his son or let him go. Lena had imagined this moment 1,000 times, but nothing could prepare her for the storm in Ethan's eyes. For 5 years, she had raised Oliver alone, building a life for him without ever whispering Ethan's name. She told herself it was for the best, that Ethan had made his choice the night he let her walk away. But when Oliver started asking questions, when he looked in the mirror and saw a face he didn't understand, she knew she couldn't keep running from the truth. So she had come here, not for herself, but for her son. Because no matter how much she had tried to shield him, Oliver deserved answers. Now, standing in front of the man she once gave her heart to, Lena felt a surge of emotions: anger, heartbreak, regret. She had loved him, and he had left her. And now he was about to marry, losing them again. Losing the family he never knew he had. The weight of the choice pressed down on him. He could see the pain in Lena's eyes, the betrayal that ran deeper than words. She wasn't here to take anything from him. She was here to see if he would fight. And for the first time in his life, Ethan wasn't sure if he was strong enough. The silence stretched. The tension was suffocating. And then Oliver, his son, spoke. "Mommy." The boy's voice was small, hesitant. He tugged at Lena's sleeve, looking between her and Ethan. "Is he my dad?" Lena's throat tightened. She could feel the entire world watching. She knelt beside her son, brushing a hand through his soft brown curls. "Yes, sweetheart," she whispered. "He is." Ethan felt his heart stop. Oliver blinked, processing. Then, in the purest, most heartbreaking way, he asked, "Why didn't he want me?" A sharp pain shot through Ethan's chest. His hands clenched into fists, his breath unsteady. Because that was the real question, wasn't it? Not just from Oliver, but from Lena, from himself. Why had he let fear dictate his life? Why had he walked away from the only woman who had ever truly seen him? Why had he missed 5 years of his son's life? The crowd whispered, Amelia's face hardened, and Lena waited for him to say something. This was the moment, the choice that would define the rest of his life. And Ethan Carlisle, powerful, ruthless, unstoppable, realized he had never been more terrified. The weight of Oliver's words hung in the air like a blade against Ethan's throat. Why didn't he want me? The question shattered every wall Ethan had ever built. He had spent years crafting his life into something untouchable: power, control, dominance. But in this moment, standing before the only two people who had ever truly mattered, he felt like nothing. Lena's eyes burned into him, not with anger, but with something worse: disappointment. Oliver looked up at him, waiting. The entire room waited. And for the first time, Ethan Carlisle had no idea what to say. His pulse pounded, his breaths shallow. This wasn't just about admitting the truth. This was about facing it. But then Amelia stepped forward. Her grip on his arm tightened, her voice sharp and desperate. "Ethan, don't." He turned to her, startled by the urgency in her tone. "This is our wedding," she hissed under her breath, though her smile remained intact for the guests. "You don't owe them anything." Ethan flinched. Didn't he? Amelia's eyes darted to Lena, then back to him, and something flickered in her gaze. Fear. Not of losing him, but of losing the security, the power, the status that came with being his wife. And suddenly, Ethan saw it clearly. Amelia didn't love him. She loved what he could offer, and the truth slammed into him like a freight train. He had spent his life running, choosing power over love, logic over emotion. He had convinced himself that vulnerability was weakness, that love was a distraction, that Lena would be better off without him. But all those justifications had led him here, to a son who thought he wasn't wanted, to a woman who had once given him her heart and learned the hard way that he wouldn't fight for it, to a life that felt painfully, suffocatingly empty. Lena took a step closer, her voice quiet but firm. "Ethan, I didn't come here to ruin your wedding. I came because Oliver deserved the truth." Ethan swallowed, his throat dry. "Lena." She shook her head. No more excuses." Her voice cracked, but she held her ground. "If you don't want to be in his life, say it now. But if you do, if you want to be his father, if you want to be more than a ghost in the background, then fight." Ethan felt his heart hammer against his ribs. "Because I won't do this to him," Lena whispered, I won't let him grow up wondering if he was ever enough for you. Enough. He had spent years convincing himself he wasn't enough for her. But Oliver, his son, was standing there, small but strong, looking up at him with hesitant hope. And for the first time in Ethan's life, he saw what real failure looked like. It wasn't losing a deal. It wasn't walking away from love to protect himself. It was standing in front of his child and doing nothing. His hands trembled. He turned to Amelia, his voice a low, raw whisper. "I can't do this." She stiffened. "What?" "I can't marry you." Gasps rippled through the crowd. The officiant took a nervous step back. Someone whispered his name in disbelief. Amelia's nails dug into his wrist. "Ethan, this is insanity. Think about what you're throwing away." He had, and for the first time in years, it didn't feel like loss. It felt like freedom. He gently pulled her hand away. "I'm sorry." She stepped back, her face pale with humiliation. "You're making a mistake." Ethan turned away from her, locking eyes with Lena. "No," he whispered. "I finally got something right." Lena's breath hitched. Ethan took a step toward Oliver, kneeling so they were at eye level. "I didn't know about you," he said, voice thick with emotion. "But that doesn't excuse anything." His throat tightened as he searched his son's face, the same face that had haunted his dreams for years without him even knowing. "I don't expect you to forgive me, but I need you to know something." Oliver blinked. Ethan swallowed hard. "I want you." His voice broke, but he didn't care. "I want to know you. I want to be your dad." Oliver's lower lip trembled. "You do?" Ethan nodded. "More than anything." Silence. Then, without warning, Oliver stepped forward and threw his arms around him. Ethan choked on a breath as he wrapped his son in his arms for the first time. The dam inside him finally broke. Years of regret, of fear, of loneliness. It all crashed down in that one embrace. He had been wrong about so many things, but not about this. He wasn't letting them go again. The room was silent, except for Oliver's quiet sniffles against Ethan's shoulder. Ethan held him close, his grip firm yet gentle, as if letting go would make this moment disappear. Lena stood frozen, watching them. She had prepared herself for the worst, that Ethan would walk away, that Oliver would have to live with the pain of rejection. But this was something she had never dared to hope for. Ethan finally pulled back, his hands resting on Oliver's small shoulders. His heart clenched at the streaks of tears on his son's face, at the hesitant hope in his wide eyes. "You're really staying?" Oliver whispered, his voice so small, so fragile. Ethan nodded. "I'm not going anywhere." Lena's breath hitched. The words felt too good to be true. Her fingers curled at her sides as she forced herself to stay rooted in reality. "Ethan, you don't have to say this just because I'm not." He turned to her then, his gaze raw and open in a way she had never seen before. "I mean it, Lena." His voice softened. "I've spent my whole life running from things I didn't understand. But this, you, him, you're the one thing I never should have let go of." Lena's heart pounded. The weight of everything, the years apart, the pain, the uncertainty, it all pressed down on her at once. "But what happens now?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Ethan exhaled, his hands falling to his sides. "That's up to you." A part of her wanted to believe him, to believe that he had changed, that this wasn't just some fleeting moment of guilt or impulse, but another part of her, the part that had stayed up countless nights, wondering how he could leave without looking back, was afraid. Lena swallowed hard. "You broke me, Ethan." His jaw tightened, regret flashing across his face. "I know." "You left," she said, her voice shaking, "and I had to pick up the pieces alone." Ethan stepped forward, closing the space between them. "I will never forgive myself for that." His fingers curled into fists at his sides. "But Lena, I need you to know something." She waited. "I never stopped loving you." His voice cracked on the last word. "Not for a single second." Lena's breath hitched. The room felt smaller, like the walls were closing in, trapping them in this moment of truth. Oliver looked between them, his small hands clutching Ethan's sleeve. "Mom?" She turned to her son, and in that instant, the last of her hesitation crumbled. This wasn't just about her. It never had been. Ethan had broken her heart, yes. But he had also come back, and for the first time, he wasn't running. She exhaled shakily. "I don't know how to trust you again." Ethan didn't flinch. "Then let me earn it." Lena stared at him, searching his face for any sign of doubt, any sign that he would retreat at the first sign of difficulty. But all she saw was certainty. And for the first time in years, she allowed herself to believe. She let out a breathless laugh, wiping at the tears she hadn't realized had fallen. "You always did have a way with words." A small, boyish smile ghosted over Ethan's lips. "You always saw through me anyway." A beat of silence passed before Oliver tugged at Ethan's sleeve again. "So, does this mean we're going to be a family now?" Ethan knelt down again, taking his son's hands in his own. "It means I'm going to do everything I can to be the dad you deserve." Oliver's face scrunched. "That's a lot of work." Ethan laughed, really laughed, for the first time in years. "Yeah, it is." He ruffled Oliver's hair. "But I'm ready." Lena crossed her arms, watching them with a mix of exasperation and warmth. "We'll see about that." Ethan turned to her, his expression serious again. "One step at a time?" Lena hesitated, then nodded. "One step at a time." As the wedding guests slowly began to murmur and disperse, as the weight of years of separation slowly began to lift, Ethan reached for Lena's hand. She didn't pull away. Maybe love wasn't lost. Maybe this was just the beginning. Love isn't just about the perfect moments. It's about the choices we make when everything feels impossible. When trust is broken, when time has created distance, and when the heart is torn between fear and hope. Can love still win? Ethan and Lena's story reminds us that second chances don't come easy. They take courage, forgiveness, and the willingness to rebuild. But is love truly enough to mend what was once shattered? What do you think? Can love conquer time, regret, and mistakes? Or are some wounds too deep to heal? Let us know in the comments, because sometimes the most powerful love stories are the ones that never really end.